Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Battleground and RMIA special podcast recording for our Battleground Chat series. Today is International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, IDDRR, and I'm thrilled to be working with Simon Levy from the RMIA on this amazing opportunity to work with the RMIA on what does disaster reduction and resilience mean. And throughout this week, we've got a series of workshops, webinars, roundtables, and of course, this first time live recorded podcast for Battleground Chats, all about that topic of disaster reduction and resilience. So Simon Levy, welcome back to Battleground Chats.
And what a pleasure to be here for what is a important and inaugural day for both Battleground and the RMIA, which is very exciting. And as you just said, the first live podcast, it is for you, it is for me. So I have my coffee. Hopefully hopefully there's no mistakes. Hopefully there's no swear words, but here we go. Let's have some fun and let's talk about a very important topic for both of us and the risk community.
Exactly. Now, for everyone who has joined, feel free to post questions and comments in the chat. I will highlight them throughout the recording and we'll have a bit of fun. But as everyone knows, the more interactive it is, even if it's with typed words, the better it will be. Now, let's start. Simon, about a year ago, we sat down and started planning what does the RMIA Battleground partnership look like in the coming year. And you said to me, let's do a disaster week linked to International Day for Disaster Reduction. So what was on your mind at the time? Where did this come from and why are we here?
As most things with me, I have the idea first and then they start to eventuate and form later. But this is an opportunity to bring forward something that's occurring at UN and international level, which is incredibly important, and bring that to the local risk community. We specifically chose you, Battleground, because of the work and the history that you have in business continuity, crisis management, and that overall organizational resilience view. You've always been aligned and shoulder to shoulder with myself in that view of disaster reduction, and we need to take that risk-informed view. But I think more importantly, and what the big driver of this was, there are some United Nations stats out there where they paint an incredibly compelling picture of disaster reduction and the amount of investment and funding that goes into that. And that overall stat for everyone to walk away is the economic cost of a disaster is increasing. The funding that's getting funneled towards investment in disaster reduction is reducing. And what that then is resulting in is for $1 that is invested can equal $4 of economic input and output.
So $1 invested in disaster reduction?
Correct.
Is $4 of resilience, basically.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's the output and that's the economic driver of why it should occur. And yet what we're seeing is the complete opposite, is that the costs are increasing and funding is decreasing. So through Battleground, through the RMIA, through the message, through the community that we collectively have, let's try and change that narrative and that story within Australia. And let's try to increase that investment that we see.
Love it. Now, the theme for this year's International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction is fund resilience, not disasters. And when I read that, I loved it, right? Because in our world, right, in the enterprise world of risk and resilience, we're all about building the strength, right? Building the resilience, building the risk know-how and knowledge so that there are no disasters, but if there are, that you can bounce back faster, right? So as they put it on their own website, right, the International Day for Disaster Reduction 2025 calls for a decisive shift. Fund resilience now to avoid paying for disasters later. I reckon
Absolutely.
that could be a motto, right? For anyone on this podcast who works in the risk or resilience world to take to their exec team, right? Fund me now to avoid disasters later. But it's so
Absolutely.
true, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
one of the challenges we know in the industry, which we hear all the time from our clients, and I'm sure you hear because you're on the road a lot, Simon, is how do I get in front of the board and execs? How do I get the funding I need? So what do you hear out there? What are some war stories that you've got around the funding, or even war stories around, case studies of they did this and this happened, or they didn't do this and this happened? What have you got to inspire us
Look,
with?
always the learning from the negative, which is, and this is well, it's probably a common story for a lot of people. So I'll try to keep it short. But I think back in the early 2000s, there was some natural disasters where they were I think there were earthquakes that occurred in a limited geographic region of Japan.
Yep.
And within that geographic region was where Coke had their either two or three factories that produced the red pigment for the Coke, so for the red paint that goes on the Coke cans.
Yep.
So with that earthquake, there was then the loss of comms, there was a loss of access. It created a huge problem for Coca-Cola. What they then did was, as part of their learning, they then sent some people there once the area was opened up, but they again made that assumption that they'd be able to communicate with their mobile phones, not
Yes.
knowing and not even thinking about considering as part of their response plan that the mobile phone towers or that communication network would be down. So there were a couple of huge learnings there for Coca-Cola. One was the communication risk,
Yep.
the co-location risk, and then what to actually use and pack in their bags for those forward sort of advanced response teams. Communication seems to be a bit of a theme
Yes.
as well.
Yes.
There
It
was
always is, right? It always is in resilience.
yeah, definitely. So there was another example. So I think most people who would have heard me sort of talk over the years would know that I spent quite a bit of time at Westfield.
Yep.
And we used to practice and practice and practice and test and push ourselves as far as we could. But there was one site in particular that did have an event that occurred, and as part of their go bag, they
Yep.
had some spare mobile phones, which was great. They considered that aspect. But what they hadn't considered was that on the day during a real live example and not the test,
Yes.
the mobile phones would be in use constantly. So the battery life would go from
Ah.
100
Yep.
down to zero so much quicker than what they would when you're doing a test and not using the phone.
Yep.
And
Yep.
yet, what was missing from their go bag?
The chargers.
Mobile phone chargers.
Yep.
Exactly.
And battery packs.
So,
But even battery packs then have issues of keeping them charged. So, yep.
yeah, totally. Yeah. So, again, it's around comms. And I think that they seem to be the biggest war stories that
Yep.
come through
And that
is
there are some,
stuff.
I remember some amazing images out of the Queensland floods back in 2011 and New Orleans and New York flooding of people landing out charging packs, generators, even hooking up bikes that people sat there and rode to charge phones, because having your mobile phone charged was such an important part of your personal resilience. And also, people and communities rely on that, right, for communication. How does the municipality get the message out if they can't get on the phones, right? One of the things I know in the SA blackout, remember a few years ago, the whole of South Australia went black.
Yes. Yep.
One of the things they learned was how long the batteries in the cell towers last,
Oh,
because
wow.
there was an assumption, oh, well, cell towers will just work forever. But no, if the batteries are degraded or they don't work as planned, you may only get an hour or two out of them. So how do they plan for that? So, but it's amazing how you said it was only when something happened that they learned this, right? So that also teaches us when you practice, you have to practice at the extremes. You have to practice everything you can think of and don't get hamstrung by the management team going, no, 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 that's too scary. I don't want to practice that.
Worse still, the risk professional not wanting management to think that the scenario test failed because we couldn't tick all the boxes or we couldn't respond properly, as opposed to using it as an opportunity to learn. And that's the
Exactly.
one thing that if anybody takes away from these conversations is when you practice to failure, practice to breaking point, and find out how resilient your organization actually is.
Yep. Yep.
And learn from that, share that, be proud of the fact that you've tested at the boundaries. I think
Exactly.
that's such a critical thing
And
for everybody.
teaching people, as you say, is so important. Just because we have findings doesn't mean we failed. And a failure, if you want to even use that word, is important in a test. In fact, I know some colleagues of mine and some competitors of mine as well that try and break the businesses to try and teach them how to do it. I personally like to, get them to breaking point, not break them, because I want them to come back for more. But the idea of testing at the extremes is really important. And I remember many people have heard me tell the story of the ex-Optus CEO being brought in front of the Senate committee and being asked, did you test the extreme event of your network being completely out? And she rightly said, no, we never thought it would happen. We didn't go that far. So whatever you think could happen, go one step further, because that is how you build resilience. And Moira just put in the chat, 100% Craig. And the other aspect is disasters don't go to plan. Know that you will fail, but you learn from them. And that is really important, right? What you need to also do is learn how to adapt in failure. So I do something, doesn't go to plan, I don't fall in a big heap. But because I've practiced and I've done it a number of times, I'm able to be more personally resilient, which helps the organizational resilience. So that's very,
So,
very true.
and I think Moira and I learned, I think collectively at Westfield. So we used to work together at Westfield. So we're well aware of part of that learning, that training, and 100% right that disasters don't go to plan. And I think as a risk profession, we need to embrace that and use that as a lesson that we can share with management as well as the board. Because there's also the board aspect as well. We don't want the board to be getting the reports and thinking negatively about the fact that
100%.
the plan failed or the disaster failed or the scenario failed, and then they don't want to reinvest. It needs to be positioned as, well, how great was this? We've learnt. And then we want the board actually asking the question, well, tell me more. What else can we learn? Where will we disrupt, or where are we vulnerable to disruption next? And what can we learn about that? This should be that perfect learning opportunity.
Exactly.
And not that negative aspect. So it's really huge. And again, if that becomes a theme for us during the week and for everybody post week,
then that's a win.
And using that, and I think that one thing I don't think that we did touch on, but is critically important, is, Craig, and we both talked about the UN aspect of all of this. And you're right, there is this huge global push. But both Battleground and the RMIA, we operate within Australia, Australasia. We've got this opportunity to almost, and I'll flip it on its head, think globally, but act locally.
Yes, I love that.
The opposite to what's really, really sort of that colloquial sort of approach there. But with that, let's see what we can do about just embedding that whole resilient approach here.
The other line I loved on the UN site was about ensured development, let's call it the work that we do, is risk informed. That was a theme throughout, right? So bringing together the risk and resilience functions and understanding the symbiotic relationship that they have is really, really important. We often debate, is it risk and then resilience? Is it resilience resilience and then risk. Which one is above the other? Which one's under? Are they together? I just use the term symbiotic. But what do you see out there, Simon?
It's exactly the same. I see them coexisting in perfect harmony together. You can't have resilience without risk, and you can't have risk without resilience. And I think that that's the perfect opportunity. In many ways, I don't know, we might sort of coin the phrase here, whether you have the chief risk and resilience officer of the future, the
Yeah,
CRRO,
the
the
crow.
CEO, the crow. I don't know, but look, I don't see them as competing in any way,
Yeah,
shape, or form. They
yeah.
absolutely coexist in perfect harmony.
Yeah, and the other term I loved is about being risk blind, right? Development investments that are risk blind could lead to the creation of new disaster risks. What a wonderful term, right? Risk blindness is what leads to failure and other things. I love that. And as Dusty just wrote in the chat, understanding your threats and how vulnerable you are to those threats is so important. It helps you understand areas to focus on, being risk informed. That is so, so important. We always go back to risk. In fact, I often get accused of picking events to test that are too real because they happen in the future. Well, no, we just look at your risks, understand your risks, and pick ones that are more likely to happen so that you're ready for them. It's the same idea.
Agree, totally. Because you're right. It is about resilience. It's about risk. It's not about reacting. It's not about being reactive. And I think that that's Dusty's point as well. Is if you understand the threats, if you understand your vulnerabilities, then you're not reacting anymore. You're
Yeah.
actually able to apply that proactive approach, which then, if we then bring that back, means that you are risk informed, and then more importantly, you have risk vision. You're not risk blind.
Oh, I love it. Look at us go, Simon, on fire, on fire. Now, one of the other themes that I think is really important is the idea of external threats, right? So often people look internally, what can be undone inside my business, me, right? But there's also third party cyber external threats, supply chain threats. And your story about Coke reminded me of a story from when I was doing a global client that manufactured plastic Coke bottles. And you know the Mountain Dew one, right? So the Mountain Dew one is green. Now, that
Yes.
particular green is made in one plant in central USA. And I was at a plant that needed that green dye or paint. And I did a whole study for them of where's that green paint? How's it going to get you? What's our risk around the loss of supply? And we found there was one road in and one road out of that plant, and it was in Hurricane Alley. No one had ever thought to overlay external forces on the supply chain. Let's look at weather events. Let's look at floodplains. Let's look at external factors that could undo that. And it was fascinating for them to go right, aha moment of, okay, I need to work with this supplier to increase their resilience to external shocks that could impact me. And that's a fascinating idea that I think is underbaked and undercooked in a lot of what we see.
And then there's an incredibly unformed thought here. So just bear with me, everybody. But we often talk about risk and strategy being almost one, and you can't have one without the other. When you're doing a business's strategy, you look externally, you look internally, you look politically, you look environmentally, and then you look sort of around systems, processes as well. So why wouldn't you then do that from a risk perspective as well? If we do it for business strategy and growth,
Yep.
why then? And you try to understand what those external threats could be from a business's perspective, competitors, you name it, just applying that same logic now to let's call it your risk assessment as well. So to me, it's again just that a little bit demonstrating a shortcoming. If
Yeah,
that's not happening, we'll look internally. We should also be looking externally as well.
exactly. Exactly. And also thinking about how can we help those external parties because their failure can impact us, right?
Absolutely.
Another really interesting story was I was doing some work in South Australia with the hospitals, and they realized through doing the BIA, the business impact assessment, that they had pretty much one supplier for sheets, for beds.
Yeah.
And so they started working on contingency plans. For example, do they just go raid the local Kmart or Target if they have a supply chain issue? And what does that mean? And how do they do it? But understanding it and making it more proactive, as Dusty so nicely put in the chat, is really, really important. Pre-thinking to avoid disaster down the track.
It then becomes a really interesting conversation. This came up recently at the RMIA's Risk Leader Tour, where in Sydney we had this beautiful sort of dichotomy of Peter Taylor from IAG from financial services, and then we had Ling Huang from Avio, which is healthcare, and that sort of retirement living approach. And both of them listed, they both sort of try to understand their threats, vulnerabilities, their internal capability, so that they can apply those different impact models, understand the different testing approaches that come through there, but a very different driver and a very different approach. And part of that conversation looked at financial services has CPS 230. That takes that whole system approach, that whole company activity. And while that's focused on financial services, what can non-financial service companies learn about that? And to me, it's still, just as you've said, it's the interconnections, it's that whole company activity. It's stress testing as part of the norm, not as something that's just additional. It's taking the scenario approach. It's understanding the data flows and looking at your supply chain. But I think more importantly, taking responsibility. And you touched on it before, and it's something that I think you see in isolation more than sort of as the whole. Those large organizations taking responsibility for the whole system approach or that whole supply chain resilience and trying to ensure that their suppliers and their suppliers are resilient as well.
And that's the suppliers, the fourth parties.
Yeah.
That's what CPS 230 has opened everyone's eyes to.
Absolutely.
Is because, to explain that, your suppliers have suppliers. Right. And so you're looking only one step back from you, but they rely on a step back and a step back. And understanding the full supply chain is absolutely key to resilience and preparedness. So that's 100%. You've got to look across the whole business. And I think just to start to wrap up, that really, when it comes down to thinking about disaster reduction and resilience, they go hand in hand. And just as you can apply to a community or you can apply to an industry, you can apply the same things internally to your own organization, right? I know the RMIA is very strong on trying to get cross-industry, cross-sectional understanding of risk. And Simon, you've been instrumental in expanding the RMIA to RMIA, the resilience part as well, given we coined a new phrase with the crow. Now we're doing the RMIA because they go hand in hand. And we've had hours of debates at the Wall Coffee Shop in Balaclava, our favorite hangout, about the idea that resilience is part of risk and vice versa.
Absolutely. Could not agree more. And hopefully in the next week or two, we can get back there. And it's been 12 months in the making, but here we are. We've actually pulled it off, which is amazing.
And said, exactly. So everybody, welcome to Disaster Reduction Week with the RMIA and Battleground. Thank you for joining Battleground Chats and our first live podcast. It's been great to have you. Thank you to everyone who put comments in the chat. Feel free to keep going on LinkedIn. Let's talk about this. Let's make sure that our execs understand, our boards understand, and let's make sure we are risk informed and not risk blind, and that we should fund resilience, not disasters. So thank you so much, Simon. A pleasure as always, my friend.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining.